It is just as if Negoro had followed us. Do you think it is likely? It might perhaps be to his advantage to follow us, if he doesn't know the country, but if he does know the country, why then? Dick did not finish his sentence, but whistled to Dingo. The dog reluctantly obeyed the call. As soon as the dog was at his side, Dick patted him, repeating, "Good dog, good Dingo, where's Negoro?" The sound of Negoro's name had its usual effect. It seemed to irritate the animal exceedingly, and he barked furiously, and apparently wanted to dash into the thicket. Harris had been an interested spectator of the scene, and now approached with a peculiar expression on his countenance, and inquired what they were saying to Dingo. "Oh, nothing much," replied Tom. "We were only asking him for news of a lost acquaintance." "Ah, I suppose you mean that Portuguese cook of yours." "Yes," answered Tom. "We fancied from Dingo's behavior that Negoro must be somewhere close at hand. Why don't you send and search the underwood? Perhaps the poor wretch is in distress." "No need of that, Mr. Harris. Negoro, I have no doubt, is quite capable of taking care of himself." "Well, just as you please, my young friend," said Harris with an air of indifference. Dick turned away. He continued his endeavors to pacify Dingo, and the conversation dropped. The other thing that had arrested Dick's attention was the behavior of the horse. If they had been as near the hacienda as Harris described, would not the animal have pricked up its ears, sniffed the air, and with dilated nostril, exhibited some sign of satisfaction, as being upon familiar ground? But nothing of the kind was to be observed. The horse plodded along as unconcernedly as if a stable were as far away as ever. Even Mrs. Weldon was not so engrossed with her child, but what she was fain to express her wonder at the deserted aspect of the country. No trace of a farm laborer was anywhere to be seen. She cast her eye at Harris, who was in his usual place in front, and observing how he was looking first to the left, and then to the right, with the air of a man who was uncertain of his path, she asked herself whether it was possible their guide might have lost his way. She dared not entertain the idea, and averted her eyes, that she might not be harassed by his movements. After crossing an open plain about a mile in width, the travelers once again entered the forest, which resumed something of the same denseness that had characterized it farther to the west. In the course of the afternoon, they came to a spot which was marked very distinctly by the vestiges of some enormous animals, which must have passed quite recently. As Dick looked carefully about him, he observed that the branches were all torn off or broken to a considerable height, and that the foot tracks in the trampled grass were much too large to be those either of jaguars or panthers. Even if it were possible that the prints on the ground had been made by eyes or other tardigrades, this would fail to account in the least for the trees being broken to such a height. Elephants alone were capable of working such destruction in the underwood, but elephants were unknown in America. Dick was puzzled, but controlled himself so that he would not apply to Harris for any enlightenment. His intuition made him aware that a man who had once tried to make him believe that giraffes were ostriches would not hesitate a second time to impose upon his credulity. More than ever was Dick becoming convinced that Harris was a traitor, and he was secretly prompted to tax him with his treachery. Still, he was obliged to own that he could not assign any motive for the man acting in such a manner with the survivors of the Pilgrim, and consequently hesitated before he actually condemned him for conduct so base and heartless. What could be done? He repeatedly asked himself. On board ship, the boy captain might perchance have been able to devise some plan for the safety of those so strangely committed to his charge, but here on an unknown shore, he could only suffer from the burden of this responsibility the more, because he was so utterly powerless to act. He made up his mind on one point. He determined not to alarm the poor anxious mother a moment before he was actually compelled. It was his carrying out this determination that explained why on subsequently arriving at a considerable stream, where he saw some huge heads, swollen muzzles, long tusks and unwieldy bodies rising from amidst the rank wet grass, he uttered no word and gave no gesture of surprise, but only too well he knew, at a glance, that he must be looking at a herd of hippopotamuses. Illustration: look here are men's hands. It was a weary march that day. A general feeling of depression spread involuntarily from one to another. Hardly conscious to herself of her weariness, Mrs. Weldon was exhibiting manifest symptoms of lassitude, and it was only Dick's moral energy and sense of duty that kept him from succumbing to the prevailing dejection. About 4 o'clock, Tom noticed something lying in the grass, and stooping down he picked up a kind of knife. It was of peculiar shape, being very wide and flat in the blade, while its handle, which was of ivory, was ornamented with a good deal of clumsy carving. He carried it at once to Dick, who, when he had scrutinized it, held it up to Harris with the remark, "There must be natives not far off." "Quite right, my young friend. The hacienda must be a very few miles away, but yet. He hesitated. "You don't mean that you are not sure of your way," said Dick sharply. "Not exactly that," replied Harris. "Yet in taking this short cut across the forest, I am inclined to think I am a mile or so out of the way. Perhaps I had better walk on a little way and look about me." "No, you do not leave us here," cried Dick firmly. "Not against your will, but remember, I do not undertake to guide you in the dark. We must spare you the necessity for that. I can answer for it that Mrs. Weldon will raise no objection to spending another night in the open air. We can start off tomorrow morning as early as we like, and if the distance be only what you represent, a few hours will easily accomplish it." "As you please," answered Harris with cold civility. Just then, Dingo again burst out into a vehement fit of barking, and it required no small amount of coaxing on Dick's part to make him cease from his noise. It was decided that the halt should be made at once. Mrs. Weldon, as it had been anticipated, urged nothing against it, being preoccupied by her immediate attentions to Jack, who was lying in her arms, suffering from a decided attack of fever. The shelter of a large thicket had just been selected by Dick as a suitable resting place for the night, when Tom, who was assisting in the necessary preparations, suddenly gave a cry of horror. "What is it, Tom?" asked Dick very calmly. Look at these trees, they're spattered with blood, and look here. Here are men's hands cut off and lying on the ground." "What?" cried Dick, and in an instant was at his side. His presence of mind did not fail him. He whispered, "Hush, Tom, hush, not a word." But it was with a shudder that ran through his veins that he witnessed for himself the mutilated fragments of several human bodies, and saw, lying beside them, some broken forks, and some bits of iron chain. The sight of the gory remains made Dingo bark ferociously, and Dick, who was most anxious that Mrs. Weldon's attention should not be called to the discovery, had the greatest difficulty in driving him back. But fortunately the lady's mind was so engrossed with her patient that she did not observe the commotion. Harris stood aloof. There was no one to notice the change that passed over his countenance, but the expression was almost diabolical in its malignity. Poor old Tom himself seemed perfectly spellbound. With his hands clenched, his eyes dilated, and his breast heaving with emotion, he kept repeating without anything like coherence the words, "Forks, chains, forks, long ago, remember, too well, chains." "For Mrs. Weldon's sake, Tom, hold your tongue," Dick implored him. Tom, however, was full with some remembrance of the past. He continued to repeat, "Long ago, forks, chains," until Dick led him out of hearing. A fresh halting place was chosen a short distance further on, and supper was prepared. But the meal was left almost untasted, not so much that hunger had been overcome by. Illustration: the man was gone and his horse with him. Fatigue, but because the indefinable feeling of uneasiness that had taken possession of them all, had entirely destroyed all appetite. Gradually the night became very dark. The sky was covered with heavy storm clouds, and on the western horizon flashes of summer lightning now and then glimmered through the trees. The air was perfectly still, not a leaf stirred, and the atmosphere seemed so charged with electricity as to be incapable of transmitting sound of any kind. Dick, himself, with Austin and Bat in attendance, remained on guard, all of them eagerly straining both eye and ear to catch any light or sound that might disturb the silence and obscurity. Old Tom, with his head sunk upon his breast, sat motionless, as in a trance. He was gloomily revolving the awakened memories of the past. Mrs. Weldon was engaged with her sick child. Scarcely one of the party was really asleep, except indeed it might be Cousin Benedict, whose reasoning faculties were not of an order to carry him forwards into any future contingencies. Midnight was still an hour in advance, when the dull air seemed filled with a deep and prolonged roar, mingled with a peculiar kind of vibration. Tom started to his feet. A fresh recollection of his early days had struck him. A lion, he shouted. In vain Dick tried to repress him, but he repeated, a lion, a lion. Dick Sands seized his cutlass, and unable any longer to control his wrath, he rushed to the spot where he had left Harris lying. The man was gone, and his horse with him. All the suspicions that had been so long pent up within Dick's mind now shaped themselves into actual reality. A flood of light had broken in upon him. Now he was convinced, only too certainly, that it was not the coast of America at all upon which the schooner had been cast ashore. It was not Easter Island that had been sighted far away in the west. The compass had completely deceived him. He was satisfied now that the strong currents had carried them quite round Cape Horn, and that they had really entered the Atlantic. No wonder that quinquinas, caoutchouc, and other South American products had failed to be seen. This was neither the Bolivian pampas nor the plateau of Atacama. They were giraffes, not ostriches, that had vanished down the glade. They were elephants that had trodden down the underwood. They were hippopotamuses that were lurking by the river. It was indeed the dreaded Tzetse that Cousin Benedict had so triumphantly discovered, and last of all, it was a lion's roar that had disturbed the silence of the forest. That chain, that knife, those forks, were unquestionably the instruments of slave dealers. And what could those mutilated hands be, except the relics of their ill-fated victims? Harris and Negoro must be in a conspiracy. It was with terrible anguish that Dick gnashed his teeth and muttered, yes, it is too true, we are in Africa, in equatorial Africa, in the land of slavery, in the very haunt of slave drivers. End of first part. Part the second. Illustration, West Coast of Central Africa. Chapter 1. The Dark Continent. The slave trade is an expression that ought never to have found its way into any human language. After being long practiced at a large profit by such European nations as had possessions beyond the seas, this abominable traffic has now for many years been ostensibly forbidden. Yet even in the Enlightenment of this 19th century, it is still largely carried on, especially in Central Africa, inasmuch as there are several states, professedly Christian, whose signatures have never been affixed to the deed of abolition. Incredible as it should seem, this barter of human beings still exists, and for the due comprehension of the second part of Dick Sands' story it must be borne in mind that for the purpose of supplying certain colonies with slaves, there continue to be prosecuted such barbarous manhunts as threaten almost to lay waste an entire continent with blood, fire, and pillage. The nefarious traffic as far as regards Negroes does not appear to have arisen until the 15th century. The following are said to be the circumstances under which it had its origin. After being banished from Spain, the Mussulmans crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and took refuge upon the shores of Africa. But the Portuguese, who then occupied that portion of the coast, persecuted the fugitives with the utmost severity, and having captured them in large numbers, sent them as prisoners into Portugal. They were thus the first nucleus of any African slaves that entered Western Europe since the commencement of the Christian era. The majority, however, of these Mussulmans were members of wealthy families, who were prepared to pay almost any amount of money for their release. But no ransom was exorbitant enough to tempt the Portuguese to surrender them. More precious than gold were the strong arms that should work the resources of their young and rising colonies. Thus balked in their purpose of effecting a direct ransom of their captured relatives, the Mussulman families next submitted a proposition for exchanging them for a larger number of African Negroes, whom it would be quite easy to procure. The Portuguese, to whom the proposal was in every way advantageous, eagerly accepted the offer, and in this way the slave trade was originated in Europe. By the end of the 16th century, this odious traffic had become permanently established. In principle, it contained nothing repugnant to the semi-barbarous thought and customs then existing. All the great states recognized it as the most effectual means of colonizing the islands of the New World, especially as slaves of Negro blood, well acclimatized to tropical heat, were able to survive where white men must have perished by thousands. The transport of slaves to the American colonies was consequently regularly effected by vessels specially built for that purpose, and large depots for this branch of commerce were established at various points of the African coast. The goods cost comparatively little in production, and the profits were enormous. Yet, after all, However indispensable it might be to complete the foundation of the transatlantic colonies, there was nothing to justify this shameful barter of human flesh and blood, and the voice of philanthropy began to be heard in protestation, calling upon all European governments, in the name of mercy and common humanity, to decree the abolition of the trade at once. In 1751, the Quakers put themselves at the head of the abolitionist movement in North America, that very land where, 100 years later, the War of Secession burst forth, in which the question of slavery bore the most conspicuous part. Several of the northern states, Virginia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, prohibited the trade, liberating the slaves, in spite of the cost, who had been imported into their territories. The campaign, thus commenced, was not limited to a few provinces of the New World. On this side of the Atlantic, too, the partisans of slavery were subject to a vigorous attack. England and France led the van, and energetically beat up recruits to serve the righteous cause. "Let us lose our colonies rather than sacrifice our principles," was the magnanimous watchword that resounded throughout Europe, and notwithstanding the vast political and commercial interests involved in the question, it did not go forth in vain. A living impulse had been communicated to the liberation movement. In 1807, England formally prohibited the slave trade in her colonies, France following her example in 1814. The two great nations then entered upon a treaty on the subject, which was confirmed by Napoleon during the 100 Days. Hitherto, however, the declaration was purely theoretical. Slave ships continued to ply their illicit trade, discharging their living cargo at many a colonial port. It was evident that more resolute and practical measures must be taken to impress the enormity. Accordingly, the United States in 1820 and Great Britain in 1824 declared the slave trade to be an act of piracy and its perpetrators to be punishable with death. France soon gave in her adherence to the new treaty, but the southern states of America and the Spanish and Portuguese, not having signed the Act of Abolition, continued the importation of slaves at a great profit, and this in defiance of the recognized reciprocal right of visitation to verify the flags of suspected ships. But although the slave trade by these measures was in a considerable measure reduced, it continued to exist. New slaves were not allowed, but the old ones did not recover their liberty. England was now the first to set a noble example. On the 14th of May, 1833, an Act of Parliament, by a munificent vote of millions of pounds, emancipated all the Negroes in the British colonies, and in August 1838, 670,000 slaves were declared free men. 10 years later, in 1848, the French Republic liberated the slaves in her colonies to the number of 260,000, and in 1859, the war which broke out between the Federals and Confederates in the United States finished the work of emancipation by extending it to the whole of North America. Thus, three great powers have accomplished their task of humanity, and at the present time, the slave trade is carried on only for the advantage of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, or to supply the requirements of the Turkish or Arab populations of the East. Brazil, although she has not emancipated her former slaves, does not receive any new, and all Negro children are pronounced free-born. In contrast, however, to all this, it is not to be concealed that, in the interior of Africa, as the result of wars between chieftains waged for the sole object of making captives, entire tribes are often reduced to slavery and are carried off in caravans in two opposite directions, some westwards to the Portuguese colony of Angola, others eastwards to Mozambique. Of these miserable creatures, of whom a very small proportion ever reach their destination, some are dispatched to Cuba or Madagascar, others to the Arab or Turkish provinces of Asia, to Mecca or Muscat. The French and English cruisers have practically very little power to control the iniquitous proceedings, because the extent of coast to be watched is so large that a strict and adequate surveillance cannot be maintained. The extent of the odious export is very considerable. No less than 24,000 slaves annually reach the coast, a number that hardly represents a tenth part of those who are massacred or otherwise perish by a deplorable end. After the frightful butcheries, the fields lie devastated, the smoldering villages are void of inhabitants, the rivers reek with bleeding corpses, and wild beasts take undisputed possession of the soil. Livingstone, upon returning to a district, immediately after one of these ruthless raids, said that he could never have recognized it for the same that he had visited only a few months previously, and all other travelers, Grant, Speke, Burton, Cameron, Stanley describe the wooded plateau of Central Africa as the principal theater of the barbarous warfare between chief and chief. In the region of the Great Lakes, throughout the vast district which feeds the market of Zanzibar in Bornu and Fezzan, further south on the banks of the Nyassa and Zambesi, further west in the districts of the Upper Zaire, just traversed by the intrepid Stanley, everywhere there is the recurrence of the same scenes of ruin, slaughter, and devastation. Ever and again, the question seems to be forced upon the mind whether slavery is not to end in the entire annihilation of the Negro race, so that, like the Australian tribes of South Holland, it will become extinct. Who can doubt that the day must dawn which will herald the closing of the markets in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, a day when civilized nations shall no longer tolerate the perpetration of this barbarous wrong? It is hardly too much to say that another year ought to witness the emancipation of every slave in the possession of Christian states. It seems only too likely that for years to come, the Mussulman nations will continue to depopulate the continent of Africa. To them is due the chief emigration of the natives, who, torn from their provinces, are sent to the eastern coast in numbers that exceed 0 annually. Long before the Egyptian expedition, the natives of Sennaar were sold to the natives of Darfur and vice versa, and even Napoleon Bonaparte purchased a considerable number of Negroes, whom he organized into regiments after the fashion of the Mamelukes. Altogether, it may be affirmed that although 4/5 of the present century have passed away, slave traffic in Africa has been increased rather than diminished. The truth is that Islamism really nurtures the slave trade. In Mussulman provinces, the black slave has taken the place of the white slave of former times. Dealers of the most questionable character bear their part in the execrable business, bringing a supplementary population to races which, unregenerated by their own labor, would otherwise diminish and ultimately disappear. As in the time of Bonaparte, these slaves often become soldiers. On the Upper Niger, for instance, they still form half the army of certain chieftains, under circumstances in which their lot is hardly, if at all, inferior to that of free men. Elsewhere, where the slave is not a soldier, he counts merely as current coin. And in Bornu and even in Egypt, we are told by William Legion, an eyewitness, that officers and other functionaries have received their pay in this form. Such, then, appears to be the present actual condition of the slave trade, and it is stern justice that compels the additional statement that there are representatives of certain great European powers who still favor the unholy traffic with an indulgent connivance, and whilst cruisers are watching the coasts of the Atlantic and of the Indian Ocean, kidnapping goes on regularly in the interior, caravans pass along under the very eyes of certain officials, and massacres are perpetrated in which frequently 10 Negroes are sacrificed in the capture of a single slave. It was the knowledge, more or less complete of all this, that wrung from Dick Sands his bitter and heartrending cry. We are in Africa, in the very haunt of slave drivers. Too true it was that he found himself and his companions in a land fraught with such frightful peril. He could only tremble when he wondered on what part of the fatal continent the Pilgrim had stranded. Evidently it was at some point of the west coast, and he had every reason to fear that it was on the shores of Angola, the rendezvous for all the caravans that journey in that portion of Africa. His conjecture was correct. He really was in the very country that a few years later, and with gigantic effort, was to be traversed by Cameron in the south and Stanley in the north. Of the vast territory, with its 3 provinces, Congo, Angola, and Benguela, little was then known except the coast. It extends from the Zaire on the north to the Nurse on the south, and its chief towns are the ports of Benguela and of St. Paul de Londa, the capital of the colony, which is a dependency of the Kingdom of Portugal. The interior of the country had been almost entirely unexplored. Very few were the travelers who had cared to venture far inland, for an unhealthy climate, a hot, damp soil conducive to fever, a permanent warfare between the native tribes, some of which are cannibals, and the ill feeling of the slave dealers against any stranger who might endeavor to discover the secrets of their infamous craft, all combined to render the region one of the most hazardous in the whole of equatorial Africa. It was in 1816 that Tuckey ascended the Congo as far as the Yalala Falls, a distance not exceeding 203 miles. But the journey was too short to give an accurate idea of the interior of the country, and moreover cost the lives of nearly all the officers and scientific men connected with the expedition. 37 years afterwards, Dr. Livingstone had advanced from the Cape of Good Hope to the upper Zambesi. Thence, with a fearlessness hitherto unrivaled, he crossed the Congo, an affluent of the Congo, and after having traversed the continent from the extreme south to the east, he reached St. Paul de Londa on the 31st of May, 1854, the first explorer of the unknown portions of the great Portuguese colony. 18 years elapsed, and two other bold travelers crossed the entire continent from east to west, and after encountering unparalleled difficulties, emerged, the one to the south, the other to the north of Angola. The first of these was Verne Lovett Cameron, a lieutenant in the British Navy. In 1872, when serious doubts were entertained as to the safety of the expedition sent out under Stanley to the relief of Livingstone in the Great Lake District, Lieutenant Cameron volunteered to go out in search of the noble missionary explorer. His offer was accepted, and accompanied by Dr. Dillon, Lieutenant Cecil Murphy, and Robert Moffat, a nephew of Livingstone, he started from Zanzibar. Having passed through Ugogo, he met Livingstone's corpse, which was being borne to the eastern coast by his faithful followers. Unshaken in his resolve to make his way right across the continent, Cameron still pushed onwards to the west. He passed through Unyanyembe and Uganda, and reached Kal, where he secured all Livingstone's papers. After exploring Lake Tanganyika, he crossed the mountains of Bambar, and finding himself unable to descend the course of the Lualaba, he traversed the provinces devastated and depopulated by war and the slave trade, Kilemba, Urua, the sources of the Lamami, Ulanda, and Lowville, and having crossed the Konza, he sighted the Atlantic and reached the port of St. Philip de Benguela, after a journey that had occupied 3 years and 5 months. Cameron's two companions, Dr. Dillon and Robert Moffat, both succumbed to the hardships of the expedition. The intrepid Englishman was soon to be followed into the field by an American, Mr. Henry Moreland Stanley. It is universally known how the undaunted correspondent of the New York Herald, having been dispatched in search of Livingstone, found the veteran missionary at Ujiji, on the borders of Lake Tanganyika, on the 31st of October, 1871. But what he had undertaken in the course of humanity, Stanley longed to continue in the interests of science, his prime object being to make a thorough investigation of the Lualaba, of which, in his first expedition, he had only been able to get a partial and imperfect survey. Accordingly, whilst Cameron was still deep in the provinces of Central Africa, Stanley started from Bagamoyo in November, 1874. 21 months later, he quitted Ujiji, which had been decimated by smallpox, and in 74 days accomplished the passage of the lake and reached Nyangwe, a great slave market previously visited both by Livingstone and Cameron. He was also present at some of the horrible razzias perpetrated by the officers of the Sultan of Zanzibar in the districts of the Marunzu and Manyuma. In order to be in a position to descend the Lualaba to its very mouth, Stanley engaged at Nyangwe 140 porters and 19 boats. Difficulties arose from the very outset, and not only had he to contend with the cannibals of Agusu, but in order to avoid many unnavigable cataracts, he had to convey his boats many miles by land. Near the equator, just at the point where the Lualaba turns north-northwest, Stanley's little convoy was attacked by a fleet of boats, manned by several hundred natives, whom, however, he succeeded in putting to flight. Nothing daunted, the resolute American pushed on to lat. 20 degrees N and ascertained, beyond room for doubt, that the Lualaba was really the upper Zaire or Congo, and that, by following its course, he should come directly to the sea. Beset with many perils was the way. Stanley was in almost daily collision with the various tribes upon the river banks. On the 3rd of June, 1877, he lost one of his companions, Frank Pocock, at the passage of the cataracts of Masasa, and on the 18th of July he was himself carried in his boat into the Embolo Falls, and escaped by little short of a miracle. On the 6th of August, the daring adventurer arrived at the village of Nysanda, only 4 days from the sea. 2 days later, he received a supply of provisions that had been sent by 2 Mboma merchants to Banza 1000 Buko, the little coast town, where, after a journey of 2 years and 9 months, fraught with every kind of hardship and privation, he completed his transit of the mighty continent. His toil told, at least temporarily, upon his years, but he had the grand satisfaction of knowing that he had traced the whole course of the Lualaba, and had ascertained, beyond reach of question, that as the Nile is the great artery of the north, and the Zambesi of the east, so Africa possesses in the west a third great river, which in a course of no less than 2,900 miles, under the names of the Lualaba, Zaire, and Congo, unites the Lake District with the Atlantic Ocean. In 1873, however, the date at which the Pilgrim foundered upon the coast, very little was known of the province of Angola, except that it was the scene of the Western slave trade, of which the markets of Bih, Kasanga, and Kazand were the chief centers. This was the country in which Dick Sands now found himself, 100 miles from shore, in charge of a lady exhausted with fatigue and anxiety, a half-dying child, and a band of Negroes who would be a most tempting bait to the slave driver. His last illusion was completely dispelled. He had no longer the faintest hope that he was in America, that land where little was to be dreaded from either native, wild beast, or climate. He could no more cherish the fond impression that he might be in the pleasant region between the Cordilleras and the coast, where villages are numerous, and missions afford hospitable shelter to every traveler. Far, far away were those provinces of Bolivia and Peru, to which, unless a criminal hand had interposed, the Pilgrim would certainly have sped her way. No, too truly this was the terrible province of Angola, and worse than all, not the district near the coast, under the surveillance of the Portuguese authorities, but the interior of the country, traversed only by slave caravans, driven under the lash of the havildars. Limited, in one sense, was the knowledge that Dick Sands possessed of this land of horrors, but he had read the accounts that had been given by the missionaries of the 16th and 17th centuries, by the Portuguese traders who frequented the route from St. Paul de Londa, by San Salvador to the Zaire, as well as by Dr. Livingstone in his travels in 1853, and consequently he knew enough to awaken immediate and complete despair in any spirit less indomitable than his own. Anyhow, his position was truly appalling. Illustration: they were seated at the foot of an enormous banyan tree. Chapter 2. Accomplices. On the day following that on which Dick Sands and his party had made their last halt in the forest, two men met by appointment at a spot about 3 miles distant. The two men were Harris and Negoro, the one lately landed from New Zealand, the other pursuing his wonted occupation of slave dealer in the province of Angola. They were seated at the foot of an enormous banyan tree, on the banks of a rushing torrent that streamed between tall borders of papyrus. After the conversation had turned a while upon the events of the last few hours, Negoro said abruptly, "Couldn't you manage to get that young 15-year-old any farther into the interior?" "No, indeed. It was a hard matter enough to bring him thus far. For the last few days his suspicions have been wide awake." "But just another 100 miles, you know," continued Negoro, "would have finished the business off well, and those black fellows would have been ours to a dead certainty." "Don't I tell you, my dear fellow, that it was more than time for me to give them the slip?" replied Harris, shrugging his shoulders. "Only too well I knew that our young friend was longing to put a shot into my body, and that was a sugar plum I might not be able to digest." The Portuguese gave a grunt of assent, and Harris went on. "For several days I succeeded well enough. I managed to palm off the country as the forest of Atacama, which you may recollect I once visited. But when the youngster began to ask for gutta percha and hummingbirds, and his mother wanted quinquina trees, and when that old fool of a cousin was bent on finding cacuyos, I was rather nonplussed. One day I had to swear that giraffes were ostriches, but the young captain did not seem to swallow the dose at all easily. Then we saw traces of elephants and hippopotamuses, which of course are as often seen in America as an honest man in a Benguela penitentiary. Then that old nigger Tom discovered a lot of forks and chains left by some runaway slaves at the foot of a tree. But when, last of all, a lion roared, and the noise, you know, is rather louder than the mewing of a cat, I thought it was time to take my horse and decamp." Negoro repeated his expression of regret that the whole party had not been carried another 100 miles into the province. "It really cannot be helped," rejoined the American. "I have done the best I could, and I think, mate," he added confidentially, "that you have done wisely in following the caravan at a good distance. That dog of theirs evidently owes you a grudge and might prove an ugly customer." "I shall put a bullet into that beast's head before long," growled Negoro. "Take care you don't get one through your own first," laughed Harris. "That young Sands, I warn you, is a first-rate shot, and between ourselves is rather a fine fellow of his kind." "Fine fellow indeed," sneered Negoro. "Whatever he is a young upstart, and I have a long score to wipe off against him. And, as he spoke, an expression of the utmost malignity passed over his countenance. Harris smiled. "Well, mate," he said, "your travels have not improved your temper, I see. But come now, tell me what you have been doing all this time. When I found you just after the wreck, at the mouth of the Longa, you had only time to ask me to get this party, somehow or other, up into the country. But it is just upon 2 years since you left Cassinge with that caravan of slaves for our old master Alves. What have you been doing since? The last I heard of you was that you had run foul of an English cruiser, and that you were condemned to be hanged." "So I was very nearly," muttered Negoro. "Ah, well, that will come sooner or later," rejoined the American with philosophically indifference. "Men of our trade can't expect to die quietly in our beds, you know. But were you caught by the English?" "No, by the Portuguese." "Before you had got rid of your cargo?" Negoro hesitated a moment before replying. "No," he said presently, and added, "the Portuguese have changed their game. For a long time they carried on the trade themselves, but now they have got wonderfully particular. So I was caught, and condemned to end my days in the penitentiary at St. Paul de Londa." "Confound it," exclaimed Harris, "100 times better be hanged." "I'm not so sure of that," the Portuguese replied, "for when I had been at the galleys about a fortnight I managed to escape, and got into the hold of an English steamer bound for New Zealand. I wedged myself in between a cask of water and a case of preserved meat, and so managed to exist for a month. It was close quarters, I can tell you, but I preferred to travel incognito rather than run the risk of being handed over again to the authorities at Londa." "Well done," exclaimed the American, "and so you had a free passage to the land of the Maoris. But you didn't come back in the same fashion." "No, I always had a hankering to be here again at my old trade, but for a year and a half." He stopped abruptly and grasped Harris by the arm. "Hush," he whispered, "didn't you hear a rustling in that clump of papyrus?" In a moment Harris had caught up his loaded gun, and both men, starting to their feet, looked anxiously around them. "It was nothing," said Harris presently. "The stream is swollen by the storm, that is all. Your 2 years' traveling has made you forget the sounds of the forest, mate. Sit down again and go on with your story. When I know the past, I shall be better able to talk about the future." They reseated themselves, and Negoro went on. "For a whole year and a half I vegetated at Auckland. I left the hold of the steamer without $1 in my pocket, and had to turn my hand to every trade imaginable in order to get a living." "Poor fellow, I dare say you even tried the trade of being an honest man," put in the American. "Just so," said Negoro, "and in course of time the Pilgrim, the vessel by which I came here, put in at Auckland. While she was waiting to take Mrs. Weldon and her party on board, I applied to the captain for a post, for I was once mate on board a slaver, and know something of seamanship. The Pilgrim's crew was complete, but fortunately the ship's cook had just deserted. I offered to supply his place. In default of better, my services were accepted, and in a few days we were out of sight of New Zealand." "I have heard something about the voyage from young Sands," said Harris, "but even now I can't understand how you reached here." "Neither does he," said Negoro with a malicious grin. "I will tell you now, and you may repeat the story to your young friend if you like." "Well, go on," said Harris. "When we started," continued Negoro, "it was my intention to sail only as far as Chile. That would have brought me nearly halfway to Angola. But 3 weeks after leaving Auckland, Captain Hull and all his crew were lost in chasing a whale, and I and the apprentice were the only seamen left on board." "Then why in the name of peace didn't you take command of the ship?" exclaimed Harris. Illustration. Both men, starting to their feet, looked anxiously around them. "Because there were 5 strong niggers who didn't trust me, so, on second thoughts, I determined to keep my old post as cook." "Then do you mean to say that it was mere accident that brought you to the coast of Africa?" "Not a bit of it. The only accident, and a very lucky one it was meeting you on the very spot where we stranded. But it was my doing that we got so far. Young Sands understood nothing more of navigation than the use of the log and compass. Well, one fine day, you understand, the log remained at the bottom of the sea, and one night the compass was tampered with, so that the Pilgrim, scudding along before a tempest, was carried altogether out of her course. You may imagine the young captain was puzzled at the length of the voyage. It would have bewildered a more experienced head than his. Before he was aware of it, we had rounded Cape Horn. I recognized it through the mist. Then at once I put the compass to rights again, and the Pilgrim was carried northeastwards by a tremendous hurricane to the very place I wanted. The island Dick Sands took for Easter Island was really Tristan da Cunha. Good, said Harris. I think I understand now how our friends have been persuaded to take Angola for Bolivia, but they are undeceived now, you know, he added. I know all about that, replied the Portuguese. Then what do you intend to do? Said Harris. You will see, answered Negoro significantly. But first of all tell me something about our employer, old Alves. How is he? Oh, the old rascal is well enough, and will be delighted to see you again, replied Harris. Is he at the market at Bih? No, he has been at his place at Kazand for a year or more. And how does business go on? Badly enough on this coast, said Harris. Plenty of slaves are waiting to be shipped to the Spanish colonies, but the difficulty is how to get them embarked. The Portuguese authorities on the one hand, and the English cruisers on the other, almost put a stop to exportation altogether. Down to the south, near Mossames, is the only part where it can be attempted with any chance of success. To pass a caravan through Benguela or Londe is an utter impossibility, neither the governors nor the chefs. Footnote 1. Subordinate Portuguese governors at secondary stations will listen to a word of reason. Old Alves is therefore thinking of going in the other direction towards Nyangui and Lake Tanganyika. He can there exchange his goods for slaves and ivory, and is sure to do a good business with Upper Egypt and the coast of Mozambique, which supplies Madagascar. But I tell you, Negoro, he added gravely, I believe the time is coming when the slave trade will come to an end altogether. English missionaries are advancing into the interior. That fellow Livingstone, confound him, has finished his tour of the lakes, and is now working his way towards Angola. Then there is another man named Cameron who is talking about crossing the continent from east to west, and it is feared that Stanley the American will do the same. All this exploration, you know, is ruinous to our business, and it is to our interest that not one of these travelers should be allowed to return to tell tales of us in Europe. Harris spoke like a merchant embarrassed by a temporary commercial crisis. The atrocious scenes to which the slave dealers are accustomed seems to render them impervious to all sense of justice or humanity, and they learn to regard their living merchandise with as small concern as though they were dealing with chests of tea or hogsheads of sugar. But Harris was right when he asserted that civilization must follow the wake of the intrepid pioneers of African discovery. Livingstone first, and after him, Grant, Speke, Burton, Cameron, Stanley, are the heroes whose names will ever be linked with the first dawnings of a brighter age upon the dark wilds of equatorial Africa. Having ascertained that his accomplice had returned unscrupulous and daring as ever, and fully prepared to pursue his former calling as an agent of old Alves the slave dealer, Harris inquired what he proposed doing with the survivors of the Pilgrim now that they were in his hands. Divide them into 2 lots, answered Negoro without a moment's hesitation, one for the market, the other. He did not finish his sentence, but the expression of his countenance was an index to the malignity of his purpose. Which shall you sell? Asked the American. The niggers, of course. The old one is not worth much, but the other 4 ought to fetch a good price at Kazand. Yes, you are right, said Harris. American-born slaves with plenty of work in them are rare articles, and very different to the miserable wretches we get up the country. But you never told me, he added, suddenly changing the subject, whether you found any money on board the Pilgrim. Oh, I rescued a few $100s from the wreck, that was all, said the Portuguese carelessly, but I am expecting. He stopped short. What are you expecting? Inquired Harris eagerly. Oh, nothing, nothing, said Negoro, apparently annoyed that he had said so much, and immediately began talking of the means of securing the living prey which he had been taking so many pains to entrap. Harris informed him that on the Konza, about 10 miles distant, there was at the present time encamped a slave caravan, under the control of an Arab named Ibn Hamish. Plenty of native soldiers were there on guard, and if Dick Sands and his people could only be induced to travel in that direction, their capture would be a matter of very little difficulty. He said that of course Dick Sands' first thought would naturally be how to get back to the coast. It was not likely that he would venture a second time through the forest, but would in all probability try to make his way to the nearest river and descend its course on a raft to the sea. The nearest river was undoubtedly the Konza, so that he and Negoro might feel quite sure of meeting their friends upon its banks. If you really think so, said Negoro, there is not much time to be lost. Whatever young Sans determines to do, he will do at once. He never lets the grass grow under his feet. Let us start then this very moment, mate, was Harris's reply. Both rose to their feet, when they were startled by the same rustling in the papyrus which had previously aroused Negoro's fears. Presently a low growl was heard, and a large dog, showing his teeth, emerged from the bushes, evidently prepared for an attack. "It's Dingo," exclaimed Harris. "Confound the brute, he shall not escape me this time," said Negoro. He caught up Harris's gun, and raising it to his shoulder, he fired just as the dog was in the act of springing at his throat. A long whine of pain followed the report, and Dingo disappeared again amongst the bushes that fringed the stream. Negoro was instantly upon his track, but could discover nothing beyond a few bloodstains upon the stalks of the papyrus, and a long crimson trail upon the pebbles on the bank. "I think I have done for the beast now," was Negoro's remark as he returned from his fruitless search. Harris, who had been a silent spectator of the whole scene, now asked coolly, "What makes that animal have such an inveterate dislike to you?" "Oh, there is an old score to settle between us," replied the Portuguese. "What about?" inquired the American. Negoro made no reply, and finding him evidently disinclined to be communicative on the subject, Harris did not press the matter any further. A few moments later, the two men were descending the stream, and making their way through the forest towards the Konza. Illustration: Dingo disappeared again amongst the bushes. Chapter 3.